My name's Kelly Hancock. I'm the Interpretation Programs Manager here at the American Civil War Museum. I'm going to be talking about 3 abolitionists who helped change America. And this talk is from a much longer talk that I do called Voices of Abolition, where I focus on a whole variety of African American abolitionists. But for today, I've just picked 3 that I think really made a significant impact. Now, as we probably all know, slavery was an issue from our country's birth. It's one thing that the Founding Fathers wrestled over when they were creating our Constitution. Men such as John Adams pointed out the contradiction of holding men in bondage in a society claiming that all men are created equal. But in spite of the divisiveness of this issue, there really was not a full-scale abolition movement underway until the 1830s. And the movement largely grew out of the Second Great Awakening, this religious revival that spread throughout the country and started to cause people to think about slavery in a different way, as something immoral, as a national sin that needed to be stamped out. Most historians date the abolition movement to William Lloyd Garrison's publication of his newspaper, The Liberator, which happened in 1831. Then in 1833, Garrison helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society. And all along, African Americans were playing a pivotal role in the abolitionist movement. In 1830, in fact, the first Negro Convention was held, marking the beginning of black involvement in this movement. However, today, the contributions of few African Americans outside those of Frederick Douglass are really not that well known. So I want to highlight a few individuals that you may or may not be familiar with. And even though most historians use Garrison's Liberator as kind of the beginning of the abolition movement, Dr. Eric Foner of Columbia University has argued that it began a bit earlier, in 1829, with the publication of David Walker's Appeal. David Walker was born in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1796. He was the son of a free African American woman and an enslaved man. And because a person's legal status was based on the status of the mother, Walker, even though his father was enslaved, was born free. He eventually ended up in Boston, where he opened a used clothing store on the waterfront. He began to attend anti-slavery meetings and became an outspoken advocate for abolition. And then in 1829 is when he published his appeal, or if you want the full title, there it is, Walker's Appeal, in 4 articles together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. And hundreds of copies of this appeal were shipped and smuggled to points in the South. And one way this is done was because Walker's clothing store catered to sailors, African American sailors, he sewed copies of the appeal into the lining of the clothing. And then as those sailors traveled, they dispersed the pamphlets. Also, coming from Wilmington, Walker had some connections in the South that he was able to use. The appeal electrified public opinion. It inspired enslaved people and struck fear in the hearts of whites. Walker's appeal did something different than what most people had done up to this time. It called for immediate emancipation, not gradual emancipation. And he uses in this appeal very vivid, very powerful language that's filled with religious fervor and is almost prophetic in its tone. So I want to share a few parts of the appeal. He said, "Do you suppose one man of good sense and learning would submit himself, his father, mother, wife, and children to be slaves to a wretched man like himself, who instead of compensating him for his labors, chains, handcuffs, and beats him and his family almost to death, leaving life enough in them, however, to work for and call him master. No, no, he would cut his devilish throat from ear to ear, and well do slaveholders know it. So what Walker was getting at is that because the black population had been held in slavery and been, in a way, almost brainwashed into this submission, that this was not the natural attitude of African men, that this is not the attitude that they should have. And then he goes on to say, the bare name of educating the colored people scares our cruel oppressors almost to death. The whites shall have enough of the blacks yet, as true as God sits on his throne in heaven. I hope that Americans may hear, but I am afraid that they have done us so much injury and are so firm in the belief that our Creator made us to be an inheritance to them forever, that their hearts will be hardened, so that their destruction may be sure. This language perhaps is too harsh for America's delicate ears. But, O Americans, Americans, I warn you in the name of the Lord, whether you will hear or forbear, to repent and reform, or you are ruined. Do you think that our blood is hidden from the Lord because you can hide it from the rest of the world? Will he not publish your secret crimes on the housetop? And before Walker's appeal, abolitionists had merely been talking about this gradual emancipation. So this was very new, this was very different language. It spurred the black community to action. And they soon became the backbone of this white-led abolition movement. Walker also spoke out against colonization, arguing that America is more our country than it is the whites. And he envisioned this interracial society where black and white people would live and work together in unity. Now, William Lloyd Garrison disagreed with the violence in Walker's appeal, but he admitted that the work held many valuable truths and seasonable warnings. And when he began publishing The Liberator, he reprinted large sections of Walker's appeal. And the appeal did another thing. It helped sway Garrison away from supporting the American Colonization Society. And the American Colonization Society was this kind of weird conglomeration of abolitionists and slaveholders and freed people. And of course, with the idea of sending blacks back to Africa and the feeling that we can't solve our racial issues, that's going to be the solution. But as a result of Walker's arguments, Garrison changed his mind about colonization. Contemporaries argued that the appeal also helped spur Nat Turners Revolt in 1831. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with Nat Turner, but just in brief, he was an enslaved man in Hampton County in Virginia. He amassed about 60 followers, and on the night of August 21st, went from plantation to plantation, killing as many as 50 people, some of whom were women and children. And then after Nat Turner's Revolt, there's this backlash against African Americans in Virginia. There were about 200 who end up being killed in this backlash. So it's this bloody episode in our history. But in this letter from Governor Floyd of Virginia, which is in the Library of Congress, Governor Floyd specifically singles out Walker. So he mentions Walker in addition to Garrison and Knapp of Boston, another abolitionist. The appeal resulted in Nat Turner's Rebellion in the states of Georgia and North Carolina and Louisiana, passing laws or reinforcing old laws that were already on the books that made it a crime to teach blacks to read and write. In the port cities of Wilmington and Savannah, free black sailors were jailed during their ship's time in port because they didn't want that interaction with the slave population. And although in Virginia, Nat Turner's Rebellion did prompt the state legislature to start thinking about emancipation, in the long run, they ended up passing laws restricting black civil liberties, such as the law against teaching blacks to read and write. Religious meetings were not allowed unless you had a white minister there. So these sorts of things were put in place as this kind of backlash to Nat Turner's Rebellion, but also just the fear produced as a result of Walker's appeal. And looking at things on even a broader national level, in 1836, the U.S. House passed a gag law tabling all anti-slavery petitions. So the talk of slavery could not even be discussed on the House floor. Slave masters put a price on Walker's head of $3,000, and the Georgia legislature offered a $10,000 reward if Walker was captured alive, only $1,000 if he were killed. Friends urged Walker to flee, but he didn't. He published a second and then a third edition of his appeal. Now, sadly, he did not live to see the influence of his work. August 6, 1830, he died of consumption. This was the same disease that his infant daughter had died from just a few days before. But because of the animosity directed at Walker, there were people who believed that he had been poisoned by Southern agents. So Walker really used the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, to drive home his points. And another abolitionist who did the same thing, who kind of follows Walker, is David Ruggles. David Ruggles, during his brief life, published hundreds of articles and at least 5 pamphlets. His Mirror of Liberty magazine, which was published on and off between 1838 and 1841, is viewed as the first African-American periodical. Ruggles urged blacks to support African-American papers. He realized that African Americans made less money, that they're being paid low wages, they're struggling to make ends meet. But he felt like this was one of those things that they needed to sacrifice for. They needed to buy these papers because to him, the papers were trumpets of freedom. And like Walker, Ruggles also spoke out against the colonization movement. In fact, this pamphlet here, The Extinguisher Extinguished or Used Up, which was published in 1834, that's the point of this pamphlet. However, Ruggles was much more than a journalist. According to a recent biographer of his, Graham Hudges, Ruggles, quote, coupled action with words and created a form of practical abolition. He steered the abolition movement away from just this realm of debate and talk to one of direct confrontation with slavery. And just a little bit on Ruggles himself. He was born in 1810 in Norwich, Connecticut. He was the eldest of 7 children, the son of a blacksmith and a caterer, both of whom were born free. His mother was a founding member of the local Methodist church, so Ruggles was educated in religious charity schools. And then at 17 is when he moved to New York City. In 1828, he opened a grocery store. But Ruggles became very active in the anti-slavery movement, and when he did that, he decided to turn his grocery store into a bookshop, which was the first African-American-owned bookstore in the country. Now, unfortunately, that bookshop ended up being destroyed by a mob. In 1835, Ruggles helped organize the New York Committee of Vigilance. And the purpose of this Committee of Vigilance was to aid fugitive slaves, because Southerners had gotten into the practice of sending agents up to the North to capture fugitive slaves and bring them back into the South. Problem was that much of the time, the agents didn't really care who they were grabbing, and they didn't go through the process of verifying the identity of the person to figure out if they really had previously been enslaved or not. So the purpose of this committee of vigilance was to make sure that there was a hearing, that there was an examination before those individuals were brought back into slavery. And the work of the Committee of Vigilance is one of many aspects of the Underground Railroad. And I think we all know that the Underground Railroad was not an actual train that ran underground, but I think it does bear mentioning that the Underground Railroad was not really a cohesive network. It wasn't one organization, but it was a number of individual efforts, of community efforts, local efforts by people across the country, kind of working independently, that all gets thrown in today and all talked about as the Underground Railroad. But through these efforts between 1810 and 1850, there are said to be as many as 100,000 slaves that escaped to freedom. And there were certainly many whites involved in this effort, but for the most part, it was a black system. And of course, today we're all very familiar with Harriet Tubman, probably the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad. Ruggles himself claimed to have helped as many as 400 slaves. And the most famous of these was Frederick Douglass. Ruggles sheltered Douglass in his New York bookstore when Douglass first came there in 1838. In fact, that's where Frederick Douglass married his first wife, Anna Murray, was in Ruggles' shop. Ruggles attacked slavery in other ways. Bless you. It was typical for Southerners, Southern businessmen, when they traveled to New York to bring their slaves with them. And under New York law, since the state had abolished slavery in 1827, slaves who spent over 9 months in the state were declared free. So what Ruggles did was to keep tabs on these Southerners coming to New York for business and pay attention to how long they stayed. And on more than one occasion, he literally went to the home where a Southern businessman was staying and informed those enslaved people that they were now free, that they could legally separate from their owner. Ruggles also kept a very keen eye on the ports and the coming and going of ships, since the international slave trade had been outlawed in 1808. So if he saw a captain that was illegally bringing enslaved people into the country, he reported that captain. As a result of his activist stand, Ruggles suffered many hardships. As I mentioned, his bookstore was destroyed by a mob. That happened in 1835. He was jailed more than once. He narrowly escaped being captured and sold south. During one encounter with ruffians, he was thrown down a flight of stairs. In another instance, he was thrown from a train. At another time, he was thrown from a ferry. The abuse took a toll on his health, and by the time he was 28 years old, Ruggles was nearly blind. He was also suffering from chronic bowel disease. So he spent his last years at the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, which had incidentally been founded by Garrison's brother-in-law, which was a commune in Massachusetts. But there, Ruggles took hydropathic treatments or water treatments and even became a doctor of hydrotherapy. He established the first water cure hospital in the U.S. He died in December of 1849, not yet 40 years old. But you have to look at what he accomplished in that short lifespan. And just kind of as an aside, another member of the Northampton commune was Sojourner Truth. And after seizing her freedom, she became a minister and a powerful spokesman of both emancipation and also women's rights. Douglass described her as a strange compound of wit and wisdom, of wild enthusiasm and flint-like common sense. But I'm not going to focus on Sojourner Truth now. The last person that I want to introduce you to is Anthony Burns. And I like talking about Anthony Burns because he has a direct connection to Richmond and to Virginia. And it was the experience of Anthony Burns This experience of his sparked a wave of reactions that helped to personalize the issue of slavery to Northerners. Burns was born into slavery in Stafford County, Virginia. Both his parents were enslaved. His mother was a cook. His father was a quarryman. He was the youngest of 13 children. And basically from the time that he was 7, he was hired out. And if you're not familiar with it, the practice of hiring out was a very common practice, especially in southern cities. Basically, it was a way to rent an enslaved person for a specific amount of time, typically for a year. And Burns went through a number of different hiring outs. In fact, that was one thing in the back of his mind, is that he didn't want to stay in one place too long, because if he ever thought about running away, he didn't want people to recognize him too easily. And Burns, because he was a very hard worker, a very keen individual, was pretty much allowed by his owner, Charles Suttle, to negotiate his various hiring out contracts a lot of the time. He ended up in Richmond. In fact, his owner, Charles Suttle, sent him to Richmond with 4 other slaves, and he was supposed to negotiate the hiring out arrangements for them and then find a position for himself, which he did. And he first of all worked in one of the flour mills in Richmond, and then later for a druggist by the last name of Millspaw. And since Millspaw didn't have enough work for Burns to do, he allowed Burns to just on a daily basis go out and find a job, find work. And then every fortnight, Burns would report back and pay Millspaw a portion of that money. And because of this, Burns was allowed to move around the city. He spent some time down on the docks and really began to think about seizing his freedom. But there was one thing that kind of held Burns back a bit, and that was that he had become a lay minister. Now, under the Virginia law, you couldn't have black preachers, but there were lay preachers or kind of deacons that could speak in the church, but they weren't supposed to meet without a white minister. Burns was one of these lay preachers, and he wondered whether it would be right for him to seize his freedom, to run away from his owner, and also whether it would be right to leave his black brethren. But he wrote that as he began to study the scriptures, the Bible set forth only one God for the black and white races, that he had made of one blood all the nations of the earth, and that there was no divine ordinance requiring one part of the human family to be in bondage to another. And he would later explain it this simply: I began to learn that there was a Christ who came to make us free. I began to hear about a North and to feel the necessity for freedom of body and soul. So Burns, one early morning in February of 1854, stowed away aboard a Boston-bound cargo ship. And he had made friends with some of the sailors, and they basically stuffed him into this very small cubby, so tight of a space that he had to lay on one side and he couldn't move. So his arm ends up going to sleep. This journey ends up lasting a lot longer than expected because the ship ran into bad weather. So it ends up being a 3-week journey. His friends would feed him once every 3 days or so because that's really the only time that they could get to him. But when he set foot in Boston, he was a free man, or at least so he thought. But about a month after he had been in the city, on May 24th, as he was walking home, he was arrested as a fugitive slave. And Burns's owner, Charles Suttle, was brought in. He recognized Burns immediately. Burns also recognized Mr. Suttle, or Colonel Suttle. So he's brought before Judge Edward Loring the next morning. Now, the Boston Vigilance Committee, very similar to the New York Vigilance Committee, heard about Burns's plight and sent a lawyer by the name of Richard Henry Dana, Jr. And you might be familiar with the name because Dana wrote 2 years before the Mast, and then during the war he served as a U.S. attorney. But Dana showed up, offered to help Burns, and Burns really at first didn't even think it was that he needed help because he felt the situation was just so hopeless that there was nothing Dana could do. But Dana was able to delay the hearing for 2 days until Monday, May 29th. Now, it just so happened that at this time there were a number of abolitionists meeting in Boston. They were holding conventions, and they held a meeting at Faneuil Hall. About 5,000 abolitionists showed up for this meeting, and they decided that they would literally rescue Burns from where he was being held in the courthouse. And they were going to wait to do that. But as they were discussing it, this smaller group of black abolitionists decided they would take immediate action. So someone burst into Faneuil Hall, let those abolitionists know that there was already an assault on the courthouse, and they joined in as well. And it ends up being a pretty big deal. In the process, one deputy was killed. In the end, the rioters were repulsed, and the U.S. Marshal asked President Franklin Pierce to send a company of Marines. And, of course, Jefferson Davis is Secretary of War under President Pierce. So Burns's hearing began on Monday, and it wasn't really a trial. All that had to be determined was if Suttle was Burns's rightful owner, and that was pretty much it. So Dana couldn't argue against those facts, but he did appeal to a higher law. He said, if you decide against him, a free man is made a slave forever. The eyes of millions are upon you, sir. You do an act which will hold its place in the history of America. May your judgment be for liberty, not slavery. Now, meanwhile, Suttle was meeting with the abolitionists, and they had agreed to sell or to buy Burns for $1,200. The U.S. District Attorney, however, found out about this, and he said, wait a minute, it is against the law to sell slaves in Massachusetts, and besides that, the government has been out this great deal of expense through all this process. So if the sale goes through, Suttle, you will be responsible for all the government's expenses. And he certainly didn't like that, so he told the abolitionists, just wait, when I get Burns back to Virginia, then we can seal the deal. So on June 2nd, 1854, Judge Loring decided in favor of Suttle. There was really not anything else he could do. And Burns is literally escorted by 5 companies of U.S. troops to the federal ship that had been especially sent by President Pierce. There were about 50,000 Bostonians who turned out to watch this procession or to watch Burns being led away. Many of the windows of the city were draped in black crepe, and from one there was a coffin suspended with the words, "Funeral of Liberty." So just an amazing scene when you think about this and the way Boston reacted to Burns being removed. Now, once in Virginia, Suttle decided that he would raise the price to $1,500. And these abolitionists who were already feeling some qualms about dealing with a slave trader decided that they just would not do that. They could not pay the price. So Burns was sent to Lumpkin's jail. That's where he was imprisoned here in Richmond. He was put in cuffs, handcuffs, and also shackles. And there in Lumpkin's jail, he endured about 4 months. He was imprisoned in the top floor of the jail, so evidently this, because it was so high, it's like right under the roof, it was stiflingly hot, fed very little food, didn't even have a bed, and was given a pail of water a week. So it was a great deal of suffering that he endured as he's imprisoned there at Lumpkin's, and then is finally sold to David McDaniel, who was a North Carolina slave trader. And then eventually McDaniel sold Burns to the abolitionist for $1,300. Once Burns was free, he attended Oberlin College, became a Baptist minister, moved to Canada, but his life was short. He died at age 28 from tuberculosis. He did join the abolitionist circuit, and he sold copies of the book that was written about his escape and trial, and that book is available online. If you go to Doc South, you can actually read it. So he sold copies of that. He spoke in favor of abolition, but the true impact of the story is not really so much his gaining his freedom, but it's the effect that his trial had on stirring up the abolition movement in the North. Burns was the first slave returned under the Fugitive Slave Act, and he was the last to be returned from a New England state. The trial was this gut-wrenching saga that brought the full meaning of slavery home to Northerners. Because up until this time, many Northerners could just say, "Well, that's the South's problem. I don't like it, but it's not really my issue." And it's after this that the abolition movement gains in momentum. Abolitionist rhetoric heated up. It's after this that Garrison burns the Fugitive Slave Act, burns the U.S. Constitution, and not long after this that John Brown is able to gain support for his raid on Harper's Ferry. And as one Bostonian resident put it, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned, conservative, compromised Union Whigs, and waked up stark mad abolitionists." So that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you.